Most of you are going to understand my English anyway, but we'll see. So this talk was originally given 2 years ago at OSCON when Perl had just turned 25, and I was just a hair over 50, so I figured I had spent half my life with Perl. I actually submitted the talk with this title, though, My Half-Life with Perl, because I thought it was a nice pun. So who am I? I'm a jack of all trades, master of some. I've done all these jobs, programmer, writer, and so on. I'm also thinner than I was a few years ago, so if you haven't seen me in a while, you may wonder where'd all that weight go. I started looking like this 3 years ago, and I would look like that, but then somewhere in the middle I looked like this, and now I look like this. I'm 45 pounds, about 20 kilos lighter than I was 3 years ago, lighter than I ever was in my life. But let's get back to the story. There's an intertwinement of Perl culture, Stonehenge, my company culture, and my personal culture, if you can use the word culture for a single person. Because a lot has happened over the time, and I'm getting older, so my memory's not as good, so you should consider this a work of fiction inspired by actual events. So if I'm ever wrong, it's because I can't remember very well. And if you disagree with my facts, you can always go to OSCON next year or this conference next year and present your own version of how this all happened. Give your own damn talk. Okay. I want to thank Elaine and other contributors for the Perl history timeline. I took a lot of things from there when I couldn't remember when things had happened. So, I liked programming, I hated writing. I chose programming as a career at age 10. I got access to a computer at age 11. It was a teletype that ran at 110 baud. Can you imagine anything running at 110 baud today except for the network for the conference? I have many hours of self-taught time through that terminal through the end of high school. I even took over teaching at school, and I also built an MSI 8080 microcomputer around the 8080 system many, many years ago. I also did not pass middle school English. I hated writing, I hated everything about that. I liked computers, I wanted to do only computers. So in high school, I took journalism, that's writing the school paper, for 3 years to avoid any real English exposure. And I found out that I could earn points by just laying out the newspaper. This is back when we did it physically, and not doing any writing. So I actually got A's in journalism all 3 years and hadn't written a single story until it was about me. Randal assembles the MSI 8080 for the school. And of course, as I was doing the layout, I put it front and center on page 1. So the only article I ever wrote was obviously in the front of the paper. But now we have to go out into the real world. I was doing contract programming at 1977 for $30 an hour, which would be the equivalent of $120 an hour today, or I think about, was it 360 real, something like that. I was doing that at age 15. I was out of high school by age 16. I never went to university. I got a summer temporary job at the largest employer in the state, Tektronix at the time, as a tech writer. They didn't have a programming position open. They had only a writing position. So I learned writing on the job, and it actually became a little more fun then. I actually liked it better. I got my organizational skills from Lyle Settle. I took technical editing from Jack Falk. So if you read the back of any Perl book that I've written, it says, special thanks to Lyle and Jack, and these are the names that I put in every book that I write. I ended up being in that writing job for 4 years, and then I migrated to a salaried position. I was the youngest salaried employee and the highest paid miner that Tektronix ever had. But after that 4 years were up, I then went on for a year as a programmer. And I realized at that point that it wasn't really different. Both of them, both writing and programming, involve expressing some art into a medium. It's just that the medium was different. Oh, and of course, they both had meetings. As I did this writing job and then a programming job later, I learned about Larry Wall. I became a very good fan of his because of his RN newsreader program. Probably none of you have heard about that if you were under the age of 40 at this point. And I also started out on Usenet, which most of you may not be aware of either. I started there in 1981, right as it was beginning. I used that as my primary newsreader for many years. And this is comments that don't need to be there, but really enjoyed the very readable man page. Well, I'll be skipping over a few of the bullets because this talk is already too long for me speaking this slowly. I also liked Larry Wall for Patch, but then Perl came along. Perl 1 came out in 1987. I downloaded it, I compiled it, I played with it a bit, and I might have, ignore that. It looked to me like a super awk, and I was already pretty good with awk. But I didn't do everything with Perl back then. I just did a few things in Perl. I rewrote a couple of my awk scripts in Perl, and so on. Perl 2 came along in 1988. It was a lot more complete, and I did start using that for everything. I have included rewriting some of the shell scripts that I've been using for months and years, and all the sort of things I was doing in GNU Emacs. So I was actually using GNU Emacs Lisp to do some of my text processing. So I started trolling Usenet. I spread the Perl word in comp.unix.questions and comp.unix shell. These were newsgroups designed to ask questions and get answers about shell programming. But often the answers would be in awk or sed or some other combination of standard tools. But I started answering as many questions as I could in Perl because I wanted more people to play with this thing that I had found out about. So inevitably, somebody said, would someone be kind enough to provide me with a script, sed awk, no Perl, please, that I could run on several hundred files? So I actually got somebody to respond to my trolling with all the Perl that I did. So I'd show the shell solution, which would be fairly long, and the much shorter and likely faster Perl solution. So I was able to then recruit a lot more early Perl adopters this way. So I was already influencing Perl. I was just a user, but because I was talking about it a lot in the news groups, people started paying attention to it. The JAF, the Just Another Perl Hacker sign-off. It was created out of boredom with all my nearly identical SIGs, because I usually would say things like, just another Perl hacker, just another Perl hacker, and I said, that's boring. So I started making it code. The first JAF was something like this, print just another Perl hacker. Then I got a little more clever because I was bored with that one. So here's print scalar reverse of the string turned around in reverse. And then I got a little more clever. This one actually ended up in the regular expressions book. I won't explain it, it's just way too much stuff. The nice thing about just another Perl hacker is that it's 25 characters long, so it's really nice for folding backwards and forwards and sideways in various ways, and I've done many, many different permutations. And mappings. So here's a string that uses the TR operator and the anagram of just another Perl hacker to print out just another Perl hacker by picking the letters from the right place in the string based on the, looks like gobbledygook string up above. Oh, and there was a FAQ about the JAFs, the just another Perl hackers, and yes, the comma must be included for it to be official. So I don't care what the fax is, I know what a just JAF is. I'm JAF number 0. It might have also inspired obfuscated Perl and Perl Golf. I think that had some influence on that, for which I apologize, because that's some of the code that people see when they see Perl for the first time. And that people think Perl is complex because of these things, the JAFs, the obfuscated Perl, and the Perl Golf thing. So I'm a little sad that I somehow inspired a bunch of people to think that Perl is just line noise. I take blame for that. Then Perl 3 came along. It was released in 1989. When Larry released Perl 3, he said, or when he was going to release Perl 3, he asked for people to help him debug it and test it. So I joined that test team. I answered his email for that. This is the predecessor of what we now call the Perl 5 porters, the group that's responsible for managing the releases of Perl. I did also, during this Perl 3 development, I inspired 3 features in Perl. The underscore file handle for tests. I apologize for that one as well. It's being taken back out eventually. The list slice, which is very handy. And the third one I'll have to explain it in context in a few more slides. So Larry's first Perl haiku was inspired by my JAFs. If you read this just right, it's a standard haiku. Print standard out Q, just another Perl hacker, comma, unless $spring. So yeah, that's actually 575 like it's supposed to be. So Perl 3 came out, and the man page for it was extensively larger than the Perl 2 man page, 20 pages versus 60 pages. When Perl was released, when Perl 3 was released, people said, we need more documentation. Now, we added a lot of documentation, not we, Larry added a lot of documentation, but what they meant was we need more tutorial documentation. And Larry says, okay, when I get some spare time. Now, I knew what that meant. He had a very busy life. He was a father, a husband, He was the church choir director. He had a day job. And yet he said, well, when I get some spare time, I'll write something up. So I followed right in behind that. I said, well, I can help. I was on the Perl 3 Alpha team, so I know the language inside and out. And I've also been professionally a tech writer for many of the preceding years. Now, I made that public message just thinking that, well, it would be something I would write for an online tutorial. But somebody at O'Reilly, the people that produce the animal books, saw that message and wrote me back privately and said, if you're going to write something up, we might as well publish it. In other words, I wasn't looking for a book deal, and I already had a shelf full of books that were written for other companies, but there was no book with my name on the cover yet. So I said, hey, we got to do this. So I wrote Larry immediately, and I said, hey, we got to do a book about Perl, and we got to make it with O'Reilly, and they are already talking about publishing it. And I suggested the name Pearls of Wisdom, or maybe it was Wisdoms of Perl. I can't remember which one it was. But Larry, of course, thankfully rejected that name. That's very good, because the Camel Book and Programming Perl ended up being a much better name for that. So we met face to face. It turns out he has relatives living up near where I live in Portland, Oregon, and we decided we could work together. And there's a quote here from a movie that most of you haven't seen, so I'll skip past that. So the book was written in trilha. Again, probably something most of you have not seen, except for the fact that it's what all the man pages are written in standard Unix. And I was quite experienced with trilha because 8 years before writing this book, I had been writing with trilha at Tektronix. And when O'Reilly's editor sent me the materials about how to write the book in trilha, they said, we were using this in-house macro package with trilha, so we want you to use that too. And when I got the documentation for it, it looked hauntingly familiar because I had actually written those macros. It turns out that one of my writers that was working for me had left Tektronix and took the macros with him without telling me, and without telling anybody really, that he took them and he started working on books with Tim O'Reilly. And so they used that on nearly every book of theirs. So what I didn't know for all these years up until the time I was starting to work on the Camel is that all those other animal books were written using macros that I had written, which I found pretty remarkable. It had come full circle. There was no change control. The book was written entirely by email. This is long before Git, long before anything like that. We just sent each other updates to the files. And I created the book design based on what I had learned from the award-winning books that I had created with Lyle. I also suggested the humorous index entries. If you've seen the Camel 1, you know that there are some very weird ones in there that would make sense only if you read them in English, though. It turns out when the book was first translated to Japanese, all of our puns, of course, didn't work, so the Japanese translator put Japanese puns in. Of course, he would not be able to explain that to me either. I also made it the first use of the word Perl with a capital to mean the language and Perl lowercase to mean the interpreter. As we were writing sections about Perl, it was really hard to tell. The language didn't stand out, so I was the first one to capitalize that. The book was written during nights and weekends because I had a day job. And 6 months of that later, we actually had a book ready to go. And Larry had also decided while we were writing the book, that it would describe Perl 4, even though the current language is only Perl 3. Because he just said, well, I control the version number, so when the book comes out, I'll just bump up the version number to 4.000 at the release of the book. I thought, well, that sounds clever. But in the preface, I said, but it might be 4.003 because of changes made after we submit the book. And that was, again, prophetic because I was right. It turns out that there were 3 minor patches released to Perl between the time that we submitted the book and the time that we actually had the book out published. I think Larry actually did that deliberately, though, just so we could say that the comment in the preface was, in fact, true. So the Camel was released in early 1991. Larry and I met at the Usenix conference in Dallas, Texas at that point. We actually shared a room. It was funny. When we were setting up the travel for this, they said, is it okay if you share a room? And I said, okay. And he says, do you know a Larry Wall? And he was my roommate for that. We brought about 200 copies of the book with us, and we signed every one of them, sold every one of them. Larry has a special camel stamp that he got at the local stationery store. It turns out it's the exact same camel that was on the cover of the Camel Book. And the reason it was the exact same camel is that the early O'Reilly books used animals from an old copyright-free set of animal prints from the 1800s. Well, this store apparently had gotten stamps made that were from the same set of animal prints. So Larry had the exact same camel that he was stamping with. Speaking of no copyright, right? If it goes long enough, it's not copyright anymore. The book became a runaway bestseller. Tim had to rethink how to do high-volume press. We had gone through what he printed for a full year in just the first 2 months. So to date, this had been the most successful book that O'Reilly has ever done. Another effect of the book is that people started thanking me for finally being able to use Perl officially. I know today it's probably no problem for any of you to use open source in your business, at work, or at school. But imagine a time back when people didn't want you to use things that were downloaded, unless they had some sort of support behind them, like a book or something. So those darn pointy-hair bosses, not trusting things without printed docs. So this book enabled a lot more use of Perl, and people, again, came up to me at conferences and thanked me for having the book written. So in 1993, a Silicon Valley company came to me and said, we want to teach Perl. Do you have anything prepared like that? And I said, not yet, but I probably could come up with something, because I'd also done a lot of training before this. And I wrote what became the original Learning Perl course, and I signed an agreement with them that said, I won't teach any classes in Silicon Valley, but you will let me teach the same course other places. And they said, fine, that we're not going out of Silicon Valley. So I wrote up a course. I retained the rights to all the examples, because I hate inventing new examples. It's boring. Larry's daughter, when I was writing the book, I needed a name for this thing, the less than greater than operator. Because as I started to teach this, I couldn't just say that thing, because that would be hard to do in space all the time. So Larry's daughter came up with the name of diamond operator for that. So that's why we call it the diamond operator these days. I named the spaceship operator because, again, I needed a name for it other than less than, equal, greater than, or having to do that in the space in front of me. So those are the official names for those two operators. So I delivered this course over and over again in Silicon Valley. When I delivered, I think it was either the third or the fourth course, someone came up to me and said, you know, I really, really like the Camel Book. It's really well written. I understand all the examples and everything. But this course teaches the material, presents the material in a very different order. And I like this a lot better for learning. So that gave me an idea. Maybe a second book. So I pitched the Perl tutorial book to Tim O'Reilly. And I said, you know, I'm teaching this little course. People are liking the order of the materials here. And they like it a lot better. And here's the chapter titles. What do you think? I got a phone call, back in the days when people made phone calls, back in about 15 minutes. And Tim said, the Camel has been a runaway bestseller. We would like you, whatever you want to do, yes, do another book. Because maybe the success would be there with that. This is the fastest pitch to acceptance I ever got. Usually it takes days or weeks for them to think about something and then come back to me with it. This was just 15 minutes. I wrote the Llama on my own over the next 6 months, again, nights and weekends. I based it on the course that I had already been delivering. I changed a few things around, but not too many. And then I went back and rewrote the course to match the changes I made in the book, using the same examples but a whole new slide deck. And then I started selling the course many times to the biggest companies like Tektronix and Intel in Portland, Oregon. And I started delivering that to those clients in parallel with writing the book. One of the best things, of the privilege that I've had teaching Learning Perl over the years, is having everybody in the same room so I could see when their eyes were glazing over, and I knew I had to change something about the way I was talking about those things. Llama 1, the first release, was released November 1st, 1993. That's a day I will never forget for reasons other than Learning Perl coming out on that day. Because that's also the day that I was confronted by local authorities about activities I had been doing at Intel. To make a long story somewhat short, there's many versions of it on the internet, so I don't want to know all the details. I was convicted in July of '95 of 3 felonies. I spent over $250,000 on lawyers and fines and restitution, And of course, that doesn't count lost work time or lost opportunities for work. That wouldn't even do that. So an interesting side effect of that, and why I bring this into the story, is that the bail and probation restrictions prevented me from working at a place without disclosing that I was also a felon. Now you can imagine the kind of awkward conversations that would lead to. Yeah, I want to come work for you. Yeah, right now I'm on probation for 3 computer crime felonies. Probably would not get very far. So one of the things that occurred to me is that when I'm teaching, I don't have the same kind of access as I would if I was a system administrator or a contract programmer or something like that. So I requested an exception for training so that I would not have to disclose my felony status when I was only training for a company, because I would have limited access to the secrets. The judge granted that exception from his original order. His original order was everything. This was just now everything is not training. Now, what does that mean? Where am I going to get to work then? I can only work as a trainer. So that rebranded Stonehenge as a Perl training company primarily. So I shifted from doing system administration, technical writing, software engineering, over to being only training because that's the only jobs I could get while I was still under the judge's order. Now, oddly enough, every place I trained, I was on the internal network anyway, having access to all those same secrets I said I wouldn't be able to touch. Oops, oh well. Okay, so Perl 5 was released in 1995. And finally, yay, objects. Well, there's a lot of things that were in Perl 5 that weren't in Perl 4. But I knew a bit about objects because I had been working around in Smalltalk in 1982. So I'd had early access to object-oriented programming even before it became the buzzword. And of course, my Camel Book and Llama books and my courses were slowly becoming out of date. I started by adding a supplement to the Llama course to introduce the Perl 5 features. Initially, it was just 4 hours on the last day, but that eventually became an entire course. We called it the Packages, References, Objects, and Modules course, but internally, of course, we just call it the PROM course, because that's too long to say. That also became the Alpaca book. So after I had done that course enough times, I pitched that idea of that book to O'Reilly. I'll get more into that in a few minutes. Some of you may have heard of the Schwartzian Transform. I did not name it. You'll see how it got named instead. I answered a question on Usenet in April of 1995. I was very brief in my answer because I was on a break from teaching a class. Someone had complained that the sort that they were doing was very slow, and is there any way to speed it up? And so I was on break from teaching a class, and I said, oh, all you have to do is the same thing I had done in Emacs Lisp, which is to pre-compute all the keys, sort the tuples around, and then get rid of the pre-computed keys in a map, sort, map transformation. So nothing new to me. That's why I wrote it so quickly. And I didn't call it decorate, process, undecorate. I only found out about that term later. But I posted that and went away. And when I came back about 6 hours later, I saw that Tom Christensen had come along and looked at that post and started with this with, Randal, how dare you throw something this complex on people without having at least a little explanation. So he pointed out my bug. He described the 5 lines of code in detail by doing it through a progressive explanation by building it up one step at a time. I used that sort of style later when I was describing it in the prom book. And he named it the Schwartzian Transformation, the Schwartzian Transform. The reason he named it is he said in the final step of his discussion, now let's get back to that Schwartzian Transform, meaning this complex piece of code that I wrote. Now, he didn't mean it to be the name of that exact transformation. And I say he named it accidentally. And then later, how I know is because later people suggested, when a sort problem was happening, to go ahead and use the Schwartzian Transform for those. Now, I don't think Tom intended that, because it upset Tom. He came along and said, I never expected people to use this as the name of that technique. And he tried to rename it to the black transform, black being a play on my name in German, which is Schwartz, which is black. Too bad that name never stuck. What's interesting, though, is as I was doing research for this talk, I Googled for Schwartzian Transform to see where else it had happened. And it turns out that some languages even have .schwartz as the way to do a map, sort, map. So my name is actually now part of a language, which one I can't remember right now, but that's pretty funny. Schwartz. So second Camel, released in September of 1996. Tom Christensen was added in as one of the co-authors, and Stephen Potter, although he later dropped out of the project. Now, because of my other duties in being a trainer, going around the world teaching classes, I wasn't really much of a writer on the second Camel. I was mostly a project leader and senior editor, so I was bringing the book together, and I was also making sure that the other two people were doing their job. And my schedule was crazy at the time, so I didn't do a lot of the original writing. Now, as a trivia point, this is the first Perl book to be written in Pod, you know, the language that all the Perl man pages are written in today. We call it pseudopod because there was a little extra stuff in there just for typesetting and things like that. Because the Camel 1, of course, was in O'Reilly TROF. The Llama 1 was in FrameMaker. But all the subsequent editions of Camel, Llama, and Alpaca, and pretty much every book that's around the Perl community for O'Reilly is written in Pod. So that was an interesting change. Chip Salzenberg was the Pum King for 5004. Pum King is the name that they give to the head of the Perl 5 porters that's actually shepherding a new release of Perl into the community. He was also remarkably good at fixing bugs. Somebody would post a bug on the Perl 5 mailing list, and within an hour or two, Chip comes back with the solution. Oh, that's this. I fixed it already, and it's current in the master. And one time, somebody had submitted a number of questions for some number of bugs, and the next morning there were about 20 patches from Chip, all covering these various bugs that had been reported the previous day. I coined the term leaving the Salzenberg on overnight. Perl 5004 Release Candidate 2 was released. The Release Candidate 2 was pretty much going to be the gold standard. In other words, it's ready to go as it is, only show-stopping bugs at this point. And I had an IRC conversation with Chip, and I said, congratulations on getting the RC2 out. And he says, thank you. And I said, yeah, too bad you didn't get the code ref arrow in. And he says, what do you mean the code ref arrow? And I say, well, you know how you can take an array ref and arrow and square brackets, or a hash ref and an arrow and curly braces to dereference it without having to have the inside-out notation of doing it with a @ sign or a % sign in the front? He says, yeah. I said, well, there's also going to be one eventually for code ref, which means you would take a code ref and an arrow and parentheses and invoke the code ref that way. And he says, ooh, that sounds like a great feature. Why didn't I know about this before? And I said, well, you know, it's too bad about that, too, because Larry wanted it. And that was the magic words. Larry wanted it. Oh, well, maybe we could put that in. Now, when I say Larry wanted it, I meant I had a conversation with Larry when Perl 5 first came out. And I said, why is there an array ref and a hash ref but not a code ref dereferencers? And this was at a lunch like 4 years earlier. And Larry said, yeah, that would be good. I don't know why I didn't put that in there. But the way I said it to Chip implied that Larry had said this recently. So yes, a bit of a clever people hacker thing there. So Chip goes, no, there's no way I can get this in. We're already at RC2. It's probably going to be too expensive or too comprehensive to fix or to put in. But then he went away for about 15 minutes. And he came back to IRC and said, it's only a 5-line code change and it passes all the tests. We're going to put it in. So I got Chip Salzenberg to make a change to an RC2 release that was a brand new feature, not a showstopper bug. And later then I told Chip that this conversation with Larry had happened some number of years before. So that was my contribution to Perl, the backwards, sideways way. So the first Perl conference happened in San Jose, California, in the August of 1997. I taught a few classes. I signed a lot more books. And of course, the Perl conference eventually became OSCON, the big conference in the US. OSCON 1 was actually also the Perl conference number 3. And it's sad over the years because OSCON now doesn't even have much of a Perl track anymore. So what first was the Perl conference now has just become a small semi-track along one part of the OSCON. And things from that period are a bit fuzzy, so I really have no stories to tell. So the Perlmongers, you might have heard of them, organized by my former business partner and current co-author, Brian Foy, in the mid-1997. I joined the initial formal nonprofit board as one of the board members. We also had David Adler, who was a big guy in the Perl community in New York, and Paul Smith, who was one of Brian's co-workers. These were born out of the regular meetings that Perl users were having in New York, which I would frequently attend. During the dot-com boom era, and shortly after that, I was doing a lot of work on Wall Street. So I was in New York probably 1 week every month, going back and forth from Portland, Oregon to New York. That was not a lot of fun, but it was good. I got to see a lot of things. So New York was the flagship event, but eventually the ideas spread all around the world. We have various meeting types. If you have a local Perlmongers group, you might recognize some of these. We would have the technical and social meetings. We would have some sort of presentation and then go to a bar. We would have the social meetings. We'd just skip the boring presentation and head right for the bar. We had technical meetings. We sit through a presentation and then some of us go to a bar anyway. And we'd have an emergency social. Someone we know who is in town for a few days, so we go to a bar with them. I think you see the common element for our Perlmonger meetings. Okay? Probably yours as well. Okay, effective Perl programming. In 1997, I had Joseph Hall as my primary trainer. We co-wrote the prom class slides together, and that's where the railroad track diagrams came from in effective Perl programming. He wanted to write a book like I did. So he pitched a book to Addison Wesley, based loosely on another famous book, Effective C++. As he was going through the pitch, he got into a little bit of trouble. And since I had done pitching of books before, I had a pretty good sense of what he was getting derailed with. So I helped him with the pitch and actually got him the book deal. The target audience would be intermediate and advanced Perl programmers. So I contributed my editing skills and a few pages and a preface, and I think I wrote the first full description of Perl's printf format string. At this point in the Perl documentation, it merely said C sees printf, and it will do the same thing almost. But I wanted a formal definition for that. So I got into the source code and actually figured out what it did. The Alpaca book. So we had been teaching the prom course a number of times, and of course that course would work well as a book. The nice thing is it picks up right where the Llama course leaves off. And the same style, an hour-ish chapter of text with a few exercises and answers. The Llama course is typically 4.5 days as a class. The Alpaca book is more like 3 days. A few times I've actually done both of those compressed into a week. It's pretty intense for the people who attend, so I haven't recommended it very much. The nice thing about that book is I wrote it on a laptop while sitting almost entirely the time in a brew pub in Portland, Oregon, or near Portland, Oregon. And of course, most of the book was written after 2 or more pints of microbrew, back when I was drinking microbrew instead of hard liquor now. So it's funny because it's been called my best writing ever. So obviously I need to have microbrew when I'm writing to make good writing. We initially called it Learning Perl's Objects, References, and Modules, turning the letters out of order slightly, but that seemed to work, so it was going to be the L Porm book. But I hated that title. So I suggested, actually the editor is the one that suggested the name, but I hated the title, so I suggested Intermediate Perl. And the editor said, books named like that don't sell, because you don't know where it starts or where it ends, and you think it's only part of the story or something. So they released the book as LPORM, Learning Perl Objects, References, and Modules. But I hated saying that title to anybody, so it's a good thing it had a nice alpaca on the cover so I could call it the Alpaca book. But guess what? For the second edition, I had a different editor. I suggested to him, let's use Intermediate Perl now. And he says, I'm fine with that title. There's no problem with that. So we just had to wait for history. And it sells quite well, thank you. So starting around 2000 with TPC4, it was OSCON 2 in Monterey, I decided I wanted to try to make more awareness of what Stonehenge does and raise more opportunities to teach classes. So I had a big party. We rented out an entire venue for an evening, and we gave away free alcohol to everybody. It was never actually an official OSCON event because my friend could do it cheaper and more flexibly. My friend Bill would go into the venue and negotiate for a fixed price, no matter how many people were there. Now, he wasn't always exactly truthful with how many people were attending the conference. So he would say, I don't know, maybe 100, 200. And then, of course, our parties were so popular, 1,200 people would show up. But it was still the same fixed price. Wasn't that nice? And Tim O'Reilly came to one of them, and Derek Story, at that time the official photographer for O'Reilly, actually came and started shooting pictures for the official OSCON website. So even though it wasn't ever an official OSCON party, it was the party. People would always make sure our Wednesday night party didn't conflict with theirs. They'd actually call us up ahead of time and said, when's your party again? I don't want to be on that same day. I always wanted it to be the blowout party of the year. And the reason I could afford that is that we were teaching at a fixed rate of around $20,000 for the week. So a customer would pay us $20,000 for our instructor, for all the materials, for up to 20 people in that course. So that meant I had a pretty good profit margin on that because that was actually a going rate and worked really well. So all we needed was 1 or 2 new clients from one of these parties that are typically buying multiple classes to completely pay for the party. So it was a no-brainer decision to spend 20 grand or 30 grand on a party when I could get a couple new clients, which I always did, and then pay for the party that way. For the release of the alpaca, we actually had a live alpaca animal brought into the bar. We didn't check the rules because they probably would have said, no, you can't do that. Bill was really good at doing that sort of stuff too. Because, of course, it's easier to seek forgiveness than to ask permission. Now, of course, that made all the weblogs the next day, all the tweets, and all the equivalent of the social media at that time. And I was really glad for that, having a live alpaca at one of my parties. So I met Leo Laporte on one of the cruises that I frequently do, where we have a conference on the cruise. Leo Laporte already had been doing a lot of podcasting. I met him in 2004. He didn't recognize me, though. I thought I was just helping out the guy who was producing the conference. Because my picture's not on my book. People don't recognize me unless they see me some other way. So we had these events on the MAC cruises called the Ingenious Bars, where a few of the speakers would get together at a known time at one of the bars and answer questions about Macintosh or iPhone or whatever is available at the time. So Leo and I were sitting there across from each other, and he says, so what do you do? And I said, oh, I wrote Learning Perl. And I also wrote a lot of other Perl things. And he looks at me and he goes, oh my God, I'm reading that right now. So imagine my surprise meeting Leo, who was one of my big heroes, and him meeting me in the same meeting and not having that sort of unusual meet. So I asked him about podcasting. And he said, well, here's what it takes, and here's how you have to do it, and here's how to get guests and things. So he started sharing with me everything that he knew about podcasting through the rest of the cruise. So I started a podcast for the cruises, which I called Geek Cruises Newses. And then Leo started with Chris DeBona a podcast called Floss Weekly. I was even a guest on that podcast, episode number 9. But then Chris DeBona had a baby. Well, actually his wife had the baby, but, somebody had the baby. And so he had to leave the show. So I took over after episode 17. I met Leo while taping his TV show. And I said, why isn't Floss Weekly coming out anymore? And he said, well, we don't have any co-host, and I don't know anybody in the open source community. I know very few people in the open source community. And so I said, well, I know a lot of people in the open source community. What would it take to get the show started again? He says, well, you'd have to find somebody and invite them, and then be the co-host on the show to help me ask the technical questions, since I don't have a big technical background. So I took over after episode 17. That was 9 years ago. We're just taped this morning, episode 434. So a lot of episodes of Floss Weekly over the 9 years. So I started first as the co-host. After I'd been co-hosting for a while, Leo had to go do some other podcasts. So he left me completely in charge of the show. So I'm now the showrunner. I'm now the producer of the show, which means that I have to find the guests, get the co-hosts lined up, do the interview most of the time, except this morning because I was down here. But I have to do nothing after that. I turn it into them. They take care of hosting it. They take care of putting up the website for it. They take care of the editing if there's any editing flaws. So it's been pretty easy. And this was written 2 years ago. I said tape 284, but now it's actually, again, 434 or 435, one of those. Now, what's interesting about that is that I'm often more recognized for Floss Weekly than for the books. So I think that was interesting because back when I was doing pretty much only Perl, I was curious about what would happen after Perl, because Perl won't be famous all the time, or maybe it'll stay famous forever. It's actually doing a pretty good job of that. But I knew I had to have some other way that people would know me so that they would hire me. And so now, when I go to conferences, people come up to me and say, hey, thanks for Floss Weekly. And a lot more than they say, thanks for those great Perl books. So I'm pretty happy about that I'm now even more famous. I did a talk here 3 years ago about lessons learned from Flossing Weekly. I think it's in the archive somewhere, but you should check that out because I talk a lot about what we learned from having done this show for this many years. So another thing that I got, besides writing the books, was writing the magazine articles. I wrote for Unix Review, also called Performance Computing. I wrote for Web Techniques. I wrote for the Perl Journal. And I also wrote for Linux Magazine. Now, what's in common with all those 4 magazines? They're all dead. Okay? So apparently my columns kill magazines. And I'm sorry for that. Okay? But I did end up writing 255 articles in all, which was good. It made me cover a lot of different topics. I learned a lot more about the nooks and crannies of Perl than I would have not having been forced to write those. But I got smart, and before I signed the contracts to write the articles, I negotiated to be able to put every one of those articles on my website. Now, a lot of them have like a delay, like I couldn't do it for 3 months, so they had sort of first rights of publication. But what's interesting is those are all there today, and they have pretty good Google juice, pretty good SEO, which is funny because sometimes I'll be stuck with something at work trying to figure out how to solve a problem, and I'll go, I think I know a solution to that, but I can't remember. So I Google, and I end up on my own articles. So I'm telling myself from the past how to solve this problem, and I went, I thought that sounded familiar. Some of the better ones that I wrote were gathered up for the Pearls of Wisdom article, or Pearls of Wisdom book, published by A-Press. And hopefully you'll get this joke. One of the reviewers said, the articles are the perfect length for a book kept in the smallest room of your home. So yes, and they take about 5 minutes, 10 minutes to read each one. I went faster than I thought. I may even have time for questions. Because now for the big finale. I want to thank the Perl community for allowing me to share and receive in a truly potluck manner. A potluck is where everybody brings food, and so you could have a lot more foods than you would have cooked for yourself. And the Perl community is like that as well. I want to thank the Perl developers and the CPAN contributors for writing industrial strength code. I never feel bad about reaching for another thing I download from the CPAN or install from the CPAN. I sometimes look at the CPAN testers first, but generally I can use that on clients' work without worrying. I also thank most of my clients for choosing Perl and often choosing to let me contribute back to the CPAN. So I've written a fair bits of code that end up in the CPAN because of employers that really understand this potluck method. I also thank the people who have worked with me over the years at Stonehenge for delivering reputable, consistent results. And although I skipped over the slide at the beginning, I also want to thank Bill Harp, a good friend of mine for 40 years, for influencing me by helping me create the parties, by having even the idea to bring an alpaca into the alpaca party. I would never have thought of that. But because he influenced me, and he influenced Stonehenge, and he also influenced Perl, they were all intertwined. My personal life, the life of what Stonehenge did as a company, and the Perl community, all intertwined. By the way, Bill Harp, a close friend of mine, passed away a couple years ago at age 45 of a heart attack. I miss him almost every day. I also thank Tim O'Reilly and the crew for publishing my books and managing OSCON, so I would have a place to give this talk initially. I also thank y'all for letting me share these stories of my half-life with Perl with you. But most importantly, I want to thank Larry Wall for being brilliant at designing and implementing a tool that he himself could use for everything. And I also thank him for sharing that with the world so we could all get stuff done while having, as he says, an appropriate amount of fun. And that's my last slide. Thank you. Thanks. And I guess we can take questions. Do I have a thing here? Yeah, this thing. In case somebody speaks Portuguese. I don't. No fala português. No follow português? Okay, something like that. All right, any questions out there? Do we have a microphone? Does anybody care to ask a question? Hand raise, please. It can be about Perl. It could be about Floss Weekly. 12 minutes? I don't see any hands. Okay, well, I'll meet you out in the hall then. Thanks.